Lecture 6, Kierkegaard's Christian Existentialism.
Like Marx, Kierkegaard's philosophy is a reaction to the Hegelian synthesis, the idea that philosophy had pretty much closed up shop once Hegel had put together the ultimate, or comprehended the ultimate purpose or goal of human life. Hegel's encyclopedic system was a kind of end to philosophy if you accepted the arguments that he made. And Kierkegaard hated everything about the Hegelian system. He hated the smug certainty of it, the kind of megalomaniacal comprehensiveness of it, the rationalism of it. And what he really disliked most, perhaps, was the Greek Promethean element of this rationality. In other words, there's a kind of splitting of the difference between Athens and Jerusalem, between reason and faith in Hegel's system, or if he doesn't split the difference, he reconciles them in a way that Kierkegaard found altogether too pat, inconsistent with his own experience of both reason and religion. Now, Kierkegaard is surely one of the most morbid and emotionally disturbed writers in the history of Western philosophy. I really like him. I find him really fascinating. He's certainly one of the funniest, and he has a thoroughly morbid sense of humor. There are so few philosophers with a good sense of humor. Kierkegaard is one of them. So if you get a chance to read this, read it with a sense of humor, and I think that you'll appreciate it a great deal more. Now, what Kierkegaard thinks is that it's impossible to completely systematize human existence. It is possible to give a good, rational, coherent account of the purpose of human life. And in fact, he thinks that the problems here are from the mixture of Promethean, humanistic Greek rationality and the strictly understood tradition of biblical faith and religion. In other words, Kierkegaard is going to reformulate the problem that's been around since the time of Augustine at least, of connecting faith and reason, but only at the cost of undermining reason, undermining the Greek element in the Western intellectual tradition, and becoming something like a modern Job, God's faithful servant, the man who will not blaspheme, who will not be skeptical of God and his wisdom, regardless of what the circumstances are. Now, Kierkegaard believes that the orientation that a person takes to the world determines their behavior, determines their activities, determines the level of human existence that they may rise to. And what's worse than this is that Kierkegaard has confronted the problem of religious faith, and he is unwilling to look away and accept any of the facile compromises between reason and faith. The kind of whistling through the dark that we get with Hegel, that they're all both really the same, and that Christianity can be easily reconciled with Greek rationalistic philosophy. Strictly speaking, Kierkegaard says no. You must make a choice between one and the other. So then the question comes, which are we to choose? Are we to choose the life of faith or the life of rationality? Are we to choose an orientation towards nature as our main ontological assumption, or are we going to go with nature plus? Nature plus, in this case, heaven. Nature plus some metaphysical realm. So we have to choose between naturalistic ontologies and metaphysical ontologies. We have to choose between Athens and Jerusalem. We have to choose between religious faith and rational certainty. And the question is, what criteria could we possibly offer for either decision that we were to make? And to make the question even more difficult, what possible grounds for this judgment could we offer that doesn't presuppose what it's trying to prove? In other words, if you presuppose a naturalistic ontology, and if you presuppose that rationality is the key human fact and that you want to orient your philosophy towards human life rather than some sort of metaphysical construct, well then you can start there and then show that it makes sense to have a naturalistic ontology and a humanistic orientation towards life and to emphasize rationality. If, on the other hand, you want to adopt a position like that of, say, St. Augustine or Luther, who think that if there's a conflict between reason and faith, well, then faith wins out every time. Luther, Augustine, people like that, prefer the metaphysical ontological conception. They prefer to emphasize faith as opposed to reason. They prefer to emphasize the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem as opposed to the tradition that comes out of Athens. Now, if you presuppose that the Bible is God's authoritative and divine word, if you assume that the tradition that comes out of Jerusalem is the true revelation of God's intentions, if you assume that the life of faith is superior to the life of reason, well, then it won't be hard thereafter for you to prove that the life of faith is superior to the life of reason. In other words, you have to make a choice between these two sets of alternatives, between the profane and the sacred, between Athens and Jerusalem, between a human-centered conception of the world and a God-centered conception of the world. And everybody makes such a choice. The difficulty is when you ask them why they make such a choice, right, they can't give you any explanation that doesn't presuppose what it is that they're trying to prove, because the orientation is built into their justification, to the legitimation of that choice. So Kierkegaard, like any good philosopher, like anyone who's morbidly introspective, decides that he's going to try and dig deeper, get to the real foundation of this problem, figure out how we're going to be able to choose between the life of faith and the life of reason. And for Kierkegaard, he can simplify it somewhat by talking about the actual orientation, the actual thing that a given person desires. And he says that the big choice in life between the humanistic and the divine, or between Athens and Jerusalem, is whether you are oriented towards the pleasurable life, what he calls the aesthetic life. And under the aesthetic life, what he means is both physical, sensual pleasures, sex and alcohol and, any physical, sensual pleasure. In addition to that, as a component of the aesthetic life, there is also the intellectual pleasures. In other words, he does not leave out the intellectual hedonists, as so many philosophers like to. So when he talks about the aesthetic life, the life in pursuit of pleasure, he's talking essentially about the Greek life, the life of rationality. Not rationality necessarily in the Kantian sense, more likely rationality in the sense that Hume uses it, instrumental rationality. Rationality used as a means to satisfy our desires. Our desires may be the physical satisfaction of our pleasure neurons, or it may be intellectual satisfactions that we get from reading works of philosophy. It is entirely possible to be an aesthetic man and not have a scandalous sex life. You may take out your aesthetic desires in the realm of art. If you frequent art galleries regularly, and that is your main solace in life, that's the greatest pleasure you get, you are still an aesthetic man, because your orientation is towards pleasure, whether it is physical or whether it is mental or intellectual. And Kierkegaard believes that that is natural to human beings, that we are born into the world of the flesh, the world of space and time, and that the natural, rational orientation of human beings will be the pursuit of pleasure, either physical or intellectual. And as a matter of practical fact, if you look back in history, it's not hard to find people that like pleasure. It's not even hard to find them now. It is a natural state of human affairs. This unfortunate tendency, this fact that we are born into the aesthetic life, or that it is the most natural and, in the sense of natural reason, the most reasonable choice that human beings, particularly untutored human beings, can make, Kierkegaard thinks that that's the analog of original sin. We are born into this world with a natural predisposition towards following the aesthetic life. That shows how depraved we are. So Kierkegaard believes that, because he's a profoundly religious thinker, that we must make a choice between the life of pleasure and the ethical life. That's the other alternative. And what he means by the ethical life is the person who pursues moral righteousness independent of pleasure. What he means by moral righteousness is the person that follows ultimately God's divine law. Whether they recognize it immediately or not, he thinks that all real ethical judgment, all ethical judgment that isn't a way of patting ourselves on the back and telling ourselves not only how virtuous we are, but how clever we are, to be able to discern the ultimate foundations of human virtue. All right? Well, Kierkegaard says that the only real alternative to the life of pleasure is the life of the ethical man, the person who follows moral rules for their own sake. In this respect, he has many connections to the Kantian project. Both Kant and Kierkegaard are trying to negotiate this maze of elements from the Athenian and the tradition that comes from Jerusalem. And whereas Kierkegaard finds a beautiful and profound synthesis which doesn't abdicate the reasonable and rational responsibilities of the philosopher, Kierkegaard does give that up. He departs from Kant. He goes towards the life of pure faith, in which reason is either superfluous or a distraction. So for Kierkegaard, there is a definite hierarchy in human existence. There are better and worse choices. And the fundamental choice that all human beings must make is between the aesthetic and the ethical life. So now the question emerges, what standard can we come up with that will allow us to kind of cover this whole area, the whole set of alternatives, which will allow us to decide which is the best thing to do? And here's where Kierkegaard makes an important contribution to philosophy. He is often considered as one of the founding members, one of the most important precursors to what in 20th century philosophy is called existentialism. He says that individual human beings, in the particular place and time that they exist, must make a choice between the aesthetic life and the ethical life. And he puts this together in a book called Either Or. It's 2 volumes. The first volume is